Two bikers pulled into a quiet gas station looking for an easy target. Imagine their surprise when they found a Vietnam War hero instead. What happened next would unravel a 100 million trafficking operation, expose a web of corruption, and teach the most feared motorcycle gang in the state a painful lesson. Sometimes the most dangerous person at a gas station is the quiet veteran filling up his '67 Mustang. They thought they were intimidating an old man, but they picked a fight with one of the most decorated Special Forces intelligence officers. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the story of how a couple of bikers provoked the last war hero at a gas station and how their moment of arrogance led to the biggest organized crime takedown the state had ever seen before. I'm so happy you're here with me. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. If this story touches your heart, please make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the Sunset Valley gas station as James Connor carefully filled the tank of his beautifully maintained 1967 Ford Mustang. The Purple Heart pin on his collar caught the late afternoon light, a quiet reminder of sacrifices made long ago. At 72, James moved with the measured precision of a man who had never forgotten his military training, even after all these years. Catherine Morgan, known to everyone as Kate, emerged from the station shop with a fresh pot of coffee. She'd owned the place for 5 years now, turning it from a rundown pit into a welcoming community hub. Stop by a community hub where truckers and locals alike find friendly faces and hot coffee. Your usual James, Kate asked, already reaching for his cup. You know me too well, James replied with a slight smile crossing his weathered face. The peaceful scene was suddenly shattered as 3 motorcycles thundered into the station. Their engines drowned out an elderly couple's car horn as they cut across its path. The bikes came to a stop, arranged in an intimidating line that blocked 2 parking spaces. Their riders, clad in black leather jackets, looked around with a sense of purpose. Tyler, known on the streets as Blade, dismounted his bike with practiced arrogance. He had a cool look about him, with his helmet off and elaborate tattoos crawling up his neck. His companions Drake and Michael, aka the Russian Russo, flanked him like well-trained attack dogs. "Look what we found, boys," he said, his voice carrying across the lot. "A real slice of American pie." James continued filling his tank, his movements unhurried and deliberate. Kate tensed slightly but maintained her professional demeanor. "Welcome to Sunset Valley," she said with a warm smile. "How can I help you?" Tyler's laugh held a hint of warmth. "Oh, how cute. Full service and everything, like stepping back in time." Drake and Russo spread out their boots, crunching on the gravel as they surveyed the station with eager interest. James replaced the fuel nozzle with a quiet click. His sharp eyes missed nothing. "Hey, Grandpa Tyler," he called out, sauntering closer to James. "Sweet ride. Bet that was new when you were young." James replied, "A '67 Mustang. Calmly, it still runs beautifully. It might look better in my garage." Tyler suggested running a finger along the car's polished hood. James turned slowly, facing Tyler directly for the first time. Something in his eyes made the younger man pause. Though he quickly covered it with a smirk, he was clearly thinking about something. "Son," James said quietly, "I've seen your type before. You think that leather and those patches make you dangerous, but you're just playing at being bad." Tyler's smirk twisted into a snarl. "You better watch your mouth. Oldtimer, I fought alongside some pretty rough characters in Vietnam." James continued, his voice steady and calm. He was talking about the kind of men who'd make you wet yourself just by looking at them. This was his last warning. Take your business elsewhere. Drake pulled out a switchblade, flicking it open with practiced flair. "Maybe we should teach Gramps here some respect," he said with a wink. What none of them noticed was Kate quietly pressing a button under the counter or the small camera above the door. Its red light was blinking steadily. She put it away. James said, not even glancing at the knife. "Put it away, sweetheart." Tyler stepped closer, his breath hot with anger. "You got some nerve, old man. Do you know who we are?" "I know exactly who you are," James replied. "That's why I'm giving you a chance to leave." Drake lunged forward, blade glinting in the sunlight. James moved with surprising speed, his hand catching Drake's wrist in a grip honed by years of combat training. With a simple twist, the knife clattered to the ground, and Drake found himself gasping in pain. "That's enough, Tyler," he said. James released Drake, who stumbled back, clutching his wrist. "I said you're playing at being bad men. Real bad men would know better than to start trouble here," James said kindly. The rumble of an approaching truck caught everyone's attention. Pete Davidson, the station manager, was returning from his supply run. The bikers exchanged glances, their confidence wavering. Tyler backed away, maintaining his sneer despite the fear now visible in his eyes. "This isn't over, old man," he said. "Nobody disrespects the Steel Scorpions." "It is over," James said firmly. "Unless you want to find out just how much trouble you're really in." The bikers mounted their motorcycles, engines roaring to life as they sped away. Kate approached James. Her hands still shaking slightly, she asked quietly, "You okay?" They carry themselves with confidence, and it's clear they're connected to something bigger. "What do you mean in Vietnam?" "I worked intelligence, so I learned to spot patterns and connections. Those weren't just ordinary bikers trying to look tough. They were soldiers in someone else's army." Kate glanced at the security camera, and its red light was still blinking. "Well, we got it all on video, at least." James smiled slightly. "Good, because I have a feeling this is just the beginning." As the sun set over the Sunset Valley gas station, none of them could have guessed just how right he was. Oh, how right he was. And how this simple confrontation would spiral into something that would shake their quiet community to its core. Pete Davidson parked his delivery truck and hurried over to James and Kate. His face was etched with concern. "Hey, those bikes leaving? Steel Scorpions, right? Are you two all right?" "We're fine, thanks," Kate assured him, though her hands still trembled slightly as she poured fresh coffee. James sat at the counter, his calm presence a stark contrast to the tension lingering in the air. "Oh, they're not just ordinary troublemakers, those patches they were wearing. They're too new to uniform. Someone's bankrolling them." "What do you mean?" Pete asked, sliding onto a stool next to James. "Back in N. I tracked supply lines, monitored gang activities. You learn to spot the signs. These guys aren't just some local gang. They're organized, well-funded." Kate leaned across the counter, lowering her voice. "Should we be worried?" "Not yet," James replied, his eyes distant with memory. "We should be careful, Pete. You know it. I think we should install some extra security cameras, especially around the back." Lisa Carter, the young attendant, emerged from the stockroom. "Miss Morgan, those bikers have been here before, haven't they?" Kate nodded slowly. "Last week, I just drove through watching the place. I didn't think much of it at the time, but they were scouting," James said quietly, testing responses and looking for weaknesses. "It's what I would have done back in the day." "Back in the day?" Lisa asked, curiosity overtaking her fear. James touched the Purple Heart pin. On his collar, Special Forces Intelligence Division, we tracked enemy movements, supply lines, and criminal networks that were funding operations against us. Pete whistled low. "No wonder you handled them so well. But why here? Why our station location?" James replied, "You're the last stop for 50 miles on the interstate. It's a perfect spot for distribution." The word hung heavy in the air. "Distribution of what?" Kate asked, though her expression suggested she already knew. "Whatever they're moving, it's probably drugs. Maybe weapons, too." The Steel Scorpion. James looked around the room, taking in the new faces and the new money that had started to change things. Someone was using them as muscle, as a front. The bell above the door chimed as a state trooper entered. Officer Martinez was a regular, stopping by every evening for coffee and conversation. "Evening, folks," he said with a friendly smile. He then paused, noting the tension in the air. "Everything's all right," Kate started to say, but James caught her eye and gave a subtle shake of his head. "Just fine," he said with a reassuring smile. Officer Martinez waited for his coffee while James observed him carefully. The officer's eyes kept darting to the security cameras, and his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his cup after Martinez left. James turned to Kate with a gentle smile. "Don't trust him. Did you see how he reacted when he spotted the cameras?" "He's nervous, Jack, but he's been coming here for years." Kate protested. "Exactly, he's watching the place for them, probably has been for a while." Lisa's eyes widened. "You think he's involved?" "Small town like this, they'd need someone in law enforcement." "Makes sense, they'd cultivate relationships years in advance." Pete ran a hand through his hair. "So, what do we do for now?" "Nothing," James said, standing up. "Act normal, but Kate, make copies of that security footage. Keep one set here. Give another to me. And whatever you do, don't let anyone know you have it." As James walked to his Mustang, Kate followed him out. "James, wait. Why are you helping us? You could just walk away." He paused, looking back at the station. "Because 30 years ago, in a village in Vietnam, I walked away. Saw something wrong and didn't stop it. Never again. And preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, please subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now." Back to the story. The rumble of motorcycles echoed in the distance. "They're watching," James said quietly. Probably have been all day. Go inside, Kate. Lock up early tonight. And remember, trust no one outside the station. As James drove away, Kate couldn't shake the feeling that her quiet life running a gas station was about to become something much more dangerous. Inside, Pete was already on the phone ordering additional security equipment while Lisa nervously watched the road through the window. None of them noticed the black SUV parked across the street or the woman inside taking photographs of everyone who entered and left the station. FBI agent Maria Ramirez had been tracking the Steel Scorpions for months, and now finally she had something interesting to report. A Vietnam vet with intelligence experience, this could be the break she needed. As night fell over the Sunset Valley gas station, the pieces of a much larger puzzle were slowly starting to come together. The bikers' failed attempt at intimidation had unknowingly set in motion an event that would expose decades of corruption and crime. But for now, in the gathering darkness, there was only the quiet hum of fluorescent lights, the soft clicking of security cameras, and the growing certainty that tomorrow would bring trouble back to their door. The next morning dawned cold. The sky was a dull gray over Sunset Valley. James Connor arrived at the gas station earlier than usual, parking his Mustang where he could watch both the highway and the station entrance. Kate was already inside, reviewing the security footage from yesterday with Pete. She pointed to the screen, saying, "Look at this." James leaned in, studying the footage. They were blocking the security camera's view of the highway, he said. It was a professional move. These guys have military training. Military, Pete said, surprised. I thought they were just. Thugs don't move like that, James replied, freezing the frame. See how Drake handles that knife. That's special ops technique. Someone's recruiting ex-military for their operation. The bell above the door chimed and Lisa hurried in. She was pale, and it was clear she'd been crying. They're back, she said, her voice trembling. 3 bikes parked across the street. James moved to the window. He was right. Tyler Drake and Russo sat on their motorcycles, watching the station. This time they weren't alone. A black pickup truck was parked nearby. There were 2 people in it. Oh my, there are more Steel Scorpions inside. They're getting bolder, James muttered. Kate, where's that second copy of yesterday's footage in my office safe? Keep it there, James turned to Pete. Those new cameras were installed last night. Full coverage of the back lot. The rumble of motorcycles grew louder as the bikers crossed the street and pulled into the station. Ty dismounted first, his swagger more pronounced than yesterday. He called out, "Miss us." Striding toward the door, he said, "Hello, everyone." James positioned himself near the counter, seemingly casual but ready. Kate stood her ground behind the register, while Pete moved closer to the phone. Tyler pushed through the door, followed by Drake and Russo. The bell's cheerful chime felt oddly out of place. Well, if it isn't our favorite war hero, Tyler sneered. He'd been thinking about their conversation the day before. James replied calmly, "Unless you're here as customers." Drake stepped forward, but his wrist was still visibly swollen from yesterday's encounter. You got lucky, old man. That won't happen twice. Luck had nothing to do with it. James said, his voice level and kind. It's not luck that your friends in the pickup are carrying weapons under their jackets. Tyler's smirk faltered slightly. You've been watching us, just like you've been watching this place for weeks. You've been marking delivery schedules, shift changes, police patrols. You're pretty smart for a gas station hero. Russo spoke up, his Russian accent thick with mockery, smart enough to know you're not really here about yesterday. This station's important to your operation, isn't it? It's got a great location and lots of traffic, plus it's perfect for moving product. Tyler's face darkened. You don't know what you're talking about, do you? Let's see. You've got Officer Martinez on your payroll, watching the place. I bet you have similar arrangements at other stations along the interstate. It's a great system until someone notices you threatening us, old man. Drake let out a low growl, and James smiled slightly, just making conversation. But since you're here, let me share something I learned in Vietnam. The thing about corruption is it leaves traces, money trails, phone records, security footage. It's amazing what a careful observer might notice. The threat in his words was clear. Tyler's hand twitched toward his jacket, but James's steady gaze stopped him. We're not done here, Tyler said, backing toward the door. Actually, we are, James replied. And Tyler, tell your boss that using having ex-military as muscle might seem like a smart move, but it has a few hiccups. We tend to recognize our own, you know? The bikers retreated, their bravado diminished as they roared away. Kate let out a shaky breath. You could tell they had guns, she said. It was a military habit, you know? You adjust your stance when you're carrying. More importantly, they just confirmed everything I suspected. By running away, they basically admitted they were up to no good. Pete asked, by reacting to what I said about Martinez and their operation, they're not just criminals, these soldiers are in someone else's war, and now we know their weakness. Lisa, who had been quietly watching from near the stockroom, spoke up. She said that Pride James said their ex-military used to be the toughest guys around. They're embarrassed by an old man who'll make them sloppy and make them want to prove something. The black SUV across the street started its engine. Agent Ramirez had heard everything through the directional microphone. James's analysis matched her own investigation perfectly. But something bothered her. He'd handled the situation so well, drawing out their reactions. It was almost like he knew she was listening. Inside the station, James watched the SUV pull away. "We had an audience," he said quietly. "Federal, probably FBI. They're building a case." Kate asked, "How can you tell?" "Because that's exactly what I would have done," he replied. He turned to face them. "Things are going to get more complicated. Those bikers will be back, and next time they won't be alone. We need to be ready." Pete was really nervous when he asked for this. He had no idea what was about to happen. The security cameras kept watching as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. In a few hours, the Steel Scorpions would report to their boss. Things were about to get really intense in this small town. But for now, there was only the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. Everyone was starting to realize that the next confrontation would be much more dangerous than the last. Tyler faced his real boss, Marcus Bishop, a former Army colonel turned crime boss. Bishop sat behind a makeshift desk. His expensive suit was a bit out of place in the dusty surroundings. "Let me understand this," Bishop said quietly. His voice carried the edge that had made soldiers tremble in Afghanistan. "You were outmaneuvered by an old man at a gas station," Tyler said. "He's not just some old man. He's ex-military special forces," Bishop replied. "He knows about our operation." Bishop's eyes narrowed. "And whose fault is that? You were supposed to establish our presence there quietly, but you let your ego get in the way." "We can handle him," Drake insisted. "Just let us go back with more men." "Shoo," Bishop said, standing his imposing frame across the room. "You've already compromised one of our key distribution points, and now we have a Special Forces veteran watching our every move." He mentioned Vietnam, Russo added. Bishop froze. What exactly did he say? Something about tracking supply lines and monitoring operations. Bishop's face lit up with a slow smile. He knew about Martinez and our surveillance. "James Connor has to be," he said. "I've heard stories about him. He was a legend in intelligence circles." "What do we do?" Tyler asked. "We can't let that gas station fall into enemy hands. It's too important to our operation. We need it clear by the end of the week. Connor is our top priority." Meanwhile, back at the station, James was showing Kate how to spot surveillance vehicles. "See that white van parked there for 3 hours?" he asked. "It's too clean for a work van. It's got tinted windows, but there are no company logos." Kate squinted through the window. There was more steel. "Scorpions." "No, it's not the same game at all. They're watching the watchers." "What do you mean?" "That FBI agent in the SUV earlier? She's got backup. They're building a case. Gathering evidence. The problem is they're not the only ones watching." Pete joined them, carrying fresh coffee. "You think Bishop knows about the FBI?" James raised an eyebrow. "You know about Bishop? Everyone knows Marcus, Bishop, Pete." He said quietly, "Ex-military runs half the county now. Nothing moves through here without his approval." Bishop James mused. "Marcus Bishop, 75th Ranger Regiment. You know of him. His unit was involved in some questionable operations in Afghanistan. Man went from decorated officer to disgraced veteran pretty quick. Now I understand the military precision in their operation." The bell chimed as Lisa rushed in from her break. "Miss Morgan, there's some men in suits asking questions at the diner across the street." James moved to the window. "Federal agents. They're mapping the network, starting with local businesses. Should we talk to them?" Kate asked. "Not yet. Bishop will have people watching. We need to be smart about this." A police cruiser pulled into the lot. Officer Martinez again. James watched as he stepped out. His movements were more hesitant than usual. "He's nervous," James observed. Bishop must have told him to increase surveillance. Martinez entered his hand, resting near his weapon. "Evening, folks, just doing routine checks." "Coffee, Jack?" Kate offered, maintaining their normal routine. "Not today, just making sure everything's secure." James met Martinez's gaze and smiled reassuringly. "We've upgraded our cameras, and our coverage is excellent now. It catches everything. Martinez's face relaxed a little. Good to hear. Stay safe. He left quickly, speaking into his radio as he reached his car. He's reporting to someone, James said. Bishop's tightening his grip. He looked at Kate. What's our next move? Kate asked. We wait. Let them make the next mistake right now. Bishop's operation is like a spiderweb. Touch one, and it's connected to everything else. The whole thing vibrates, and we need to be patient. The sound of motorcycles echoed in the distance, and more steel scorpions. Lisa asked nervously, and James shook his head. No, different engine sounds, he said. These are Harleys. Bishop was sending his veteran riders and professional enforcers. 3 motorcycles appeared on the horizon, and their riders were wearing different patches. One had a red skull with military insignia. Kate said quietly, Get Lisa into the back, Pete. Remember what I showed you about the camera? It's time to see what Bishop is really willing to risk it all. The Harley pulled into the lot, and their engines growled like predators. The riders dismounted with military precision, no wasted movement, no showboating like the steel scorpions. This is where it gets interesting, James said, adjusting his purple heart pin. The lead rider removed his helmet, revealing a face marked by combat scars. James recognized him immediately. Samuel Ghost Wilson, former Delta Force operative, now Bishop's top enforcer. Time to see how deep this rabbit hole really goes, James muttered. The bell chimed once again, and the real players were finally showing their hands. The quiet gas station was about to become a battlefield in a war that had been brewing for years. But this time, Bishop's men weren't facing some small-town business owner. They were facing a man who had spent his life understanding how criminal empires worked and how to tear them down from the inside. Samuel Ghost Wilson strode into the station like he owned it, flanked by 2 equally imposing men. Their leather jackets bore combat medals turned into gang patches, a mockery of their military service. Jackets bearing combat medals turned into gang patches, a bit of a joke really, given their military service. James Connor said, his voice gravelly from old war wounds. It had been a long time. James didn't move from his position near the counter. Desert Storm 91, you were running spec ops while I was gathering intel. A good memory for an old man, and good enough to remember why they called you Ghost 10, with 10 confirmed kills in one night, never leaving a trace. Ghost's scarred face twisted into something resembling a. Bishop said you were sharp, and I think he was right. Bishop James said quietly, still hiding behind better men. I see you don't know him like I do. Do you know, man, he's got vision. Ghost's companions shifted their stance, subtle combat-ready movements that didn't escape James's notice. Careful, Connor, respect goes both ways. Respect. James stepped forward. You want to talk about respect? Look at your patches on those medals. Men died, earning those. Now you wear them while running protection for a criminal. Ghost's face darkened. You don't understand what Bishop's building. This isn't just about money. We're creating something bigger. I understand perfectly. Bishop finds veterans who feel abandoned by the system. He offers them purpose, brotherhood, and money. Same tactics terrorist cells use to recruit. We take care of our own. Ghost growled by turning them into criminals. Those steel scorpions you're using, young veterans fresh from Afghanistan. And Iraq, you're corrupting everything they fought for. Kate watched the exchange, silently noting how James was deliberately pushing Ghost's buttons. Pete had moved closer to the silent alarm while Lisa appeared nervously from the stockroom door. You're fighting the wrong war, Ghost. James continued. Bishop's using you just like he uses Martinez, just like he uses everyone. Last warning, Connor, back off. This station is important to the operation. Don't make us do this the hard way. James smiled slightly. The hard way, like in Kuwait, when your unit got pinned down and had to be rescued by a bunch of intel officers. Ghost moved with explosive speed, but James was ready. He sidestepped the punch and used Ghost's momentum to send him stumbling into a display rack, still telegraphing your moves. James said calmly. Ghost's companions reached for weapons, but James's voice stopped them. I wouldn't want those FBI agents across the street to have been photographing everyone who enters this station, plus Kate's new. Cameras are streaming everything to a secure server. Ghost straightened up his military training, asserting itself over his anger. This isn't over, Connor. It is. Tell Bishop I know about the shipments, about the whole operation. One phone call, and everything he's built collapses. You're bluffing, am I? I asked him about Operation Sandstorm, about what really happened to those missing supplies in 91. I wasn't just gathering intel back then, Ghost. I was building files, insurance. Ghost's face went pale. How do you like this? He said. I'm sharp now. Get out of my station. The three men retreated, their professional demeanor shaken as their Harley roared away. Kate turned to James. You know something about Bishop, don't you? Something big. James nodded. Bishop's operation isn't just about drugs. It's about weapons, military-grade hardware disappearing from bases and showing up in criminal hands. This has been happening for years, and you can prove it. I can prove that Bishop was involved in similar operations. During Desert Storm, he's been running this game for decades. That's why the FBI is watching. Pete realized partly, but they're missing the bigger picture. Bishop's not just a criminal, he's building an army. He's using veterans who feel betrayed by the system. He's turning their skills to his advantage. What do we do now? Lisa asked, emerging from the stockroom. We wait. Ghost will report to Bishop. Things will escalate quickly after that. Why did you provoke him? Kate asked, bringing up Kuwait. James smiled. Grimly, because now Bishop knows I'm not just some old man who got lucky with his steel scorpions. He knows I'm a real threat, and men like Bishop don't handle threats well. They get sloppy. You're using his pride against him, Pete said with a kind smile. Dawning just like in Vietnam. Sometimes the best way to destroy an enemy is to let him destroy himself. Outside, the FBI surveillance team photographed Ghost's departure. Agent Ramirez spoke quietly into her radio. Target is. Oh my, things are moving fast. Sir Connor just confirmed the weapon's angle, and it looks like Bishop's operation is bigger than we thought. The pieces are falling into place, but we've still got a way to go. Bishop wouldn't take this challenge lying down, and James knew that the next move would be decisive. The quiet gas station had become a battleground in a conflict that had been brewing for 30 years. Years and James, Connor, the last war hero, was ready to finish what had started in the desert all those years ago. Marcus Bishop, he gave his fist a little slap on the desk, making Ghost flinch despite his years of combat experience. You know about sandstorms, don't you? He's absolutely certain. His exact words were that he was building files back then. Insurance Bishop paced the warehouse office, his expensive shoes raising dust with each step. Connor wasn't just intelligence. He was counter-operations, specialized in dismantling criminal networks within the military. What's our move? Tyler asked from his corner of the room. The Steel Scorpion's leader looked small compared to. Ghost's battle-hardened presence made it clear that we needed to shut him down tonight. Bishop turned to Ghost and said, Take your best men. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong, sir. Ghost hesitated. Connor's not alone. FBI surveillance is heavy, and he's got cameras everywhere. Then get rid of the cameras first, cut the power, create confusion. Bishop's voice carried the command authority of his military days. He was so serious, but he was also kind. He wanted that station dark and Connor gone before midnight. Meanwhile, at the gas station, James was teaching Kate and Pete how to spot surveillance patterns. Have you noticed how that blue sedan keeps circling? It's classic counter-surveillance. They're watching the FBI watching us. How many teams are out there? Kate asked, amazed at the complex dance playing out on their quiet street. At least 3 FBI, Bishop's men, and James paused, studying a distant vehicle. Someone new. It's a military vehicle with unmarked plates. It's probably military police. Pete suggested. No, something else. Bishop's operation must have attracted attention from higher up. Lisa rushed in from taking out the trash. Mr. Connor, I just saw Tyler and those steel scorpions. James muttered. Bishop's getting desperate. Why? Kate asked. Because I mentioned Sandstorm. It's not just about current operations. It's about what happened 30 years ago. Bishop's entire empire is built on secrets from Desert Storm. His voice was as smooth as silk, carrying decades of authority. Marcus, my friend, I think we should talk. Nothing to talk about, though. You're still fighting a war that ended 30 years ago. I'm building something important, something that's going to give purpose to men. The system abandoned you, and you're exploiting them by using their skills for your criminal empire. I'm creating order and structure, something these men understand. I'm not asking you to give up running drugs or stealing weapons. I'm asking you to give up chaos in uniform. Last chance, James. Walk away from those files. You said they're ancient history, James said firmly. They're insurance, and you know exactly what they contain. That leaves me no choice. Bishop's voice hardened. Remember, Basra, sometimes darkness is necessary for victory. The line went dead. James turned to the others. Pete, check the backup generators. Kate, get Lisa somewhere safe. They're coming tonight. What did he mean about Basra? Kate asked. It's a warning in Basra. They cut power to entire sectors before major operations. James moved to the window. They'll try to cut us off and make things messy if we call the police. Pete asked, reaching for the phone. They're already in trouble. Martinez isn't the only one on Bishop's payroll. James checked his watch. We have about 2 hours until sunset. That's when they'll move. What's the plan, Kate? Her voice was calm, despite her fear. We let them come, but this time we're ready. James pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. And we're not alone. The voice that answered was familiar. Connor. It's been a long time, Thompson. Remember that favor you owe me from Riyadh? It's time to collect. Across town, CIA agent David Thompson put down his phone and turned to Agent Ramirez. Connor's in operations. Bishop's empire was about to face something it had never encountered. A coordinated response from multiple agencies led by a man who had spent his life understanding how criminal empires worked. As the sun began to set, James watched Bishop's forces. Gathering in the shadows, the quiet gas station was about to become ground zero in a war 3 decades in the making. This time, the last war hero wasn't fighting alone. Sunset Valley was filled with darkness as James Connor made final preparations. He'd sent Lisa home and positioned Pete near the backup generator controls. Kate, however, refused to leave. She was checking security feeds from her office. James had marked positions on a station map. He'd also marked the locations of 3 teams: Ghost's veterans at the north end, Steel Scorpions to the south, and Bishop's personal security. In those black SUVs across the street, they're really going to attack a gas station? Kate asked, watching shadows move on her security screens. Not just attacking. Bishop wants to send a message. Show everyone what happens to people who stand up to him. The phone rang again. This time it was Thompson. Connor, we've got movement. Bishop's called in every operator. He has at least 30 men. Good. James replied. More witnesses to his downfall. You sure about this? We could move in now. We've got to protect the station. We can't let Bishop show his hand. We need to prove the connection between his current operation in Desert Storm, and you're sure he will. He has to see the files I mentioned. They don't exist. Kate's eyes widened at this revelation. It's a bluff, Thompson asked. Bishop doesn't know that his guilt will make him act to silence a threat that isn't real. That's when we'll have him. The first sign of the attack came at 9:47 p.m. The street lights went dark, and then the power went out in the surrounding buildings. But when they tried to cut the station's power, Pete was ready. The backup generators kicked in immediately. They'll try to jam the communications next, James said calmly. It's a standard tactical approach. Sure enough, cell phones lost the signal, but the landline running through an old copper network stayed active. Ghost's voice crackled over a loudspeaker. Connor, it's your last chance to walk away. We never were good at negotiations, were we, Sam? James called. The sound of motorcycles filled the air as the Steel Scorpions moved into position. Tyler's voice carried across the parking lot. Nowhere to run. Old man James smiled slightly. Kate, remember what I told you about the security feeds? She nodded, pressing a sequence on her computer. The footage began uploading to multiple secure servers. They're moving in, Pete warned from his position. Let them come, James said. Thompson's teams are in position. We just need Bishop to show himself. The attack began with a flash. James had been ready for this, so he quickly moved to put out the fire. He was ready for anything. The device landed in a bucket of water, fizzling harmlessly. James muttered, "Amateur move." Ghost was getting sloppy. The Steel Scorpions charged first, breaking windows and trying to force their way in. James was ready for this too. The fire suppression system activated, spraying them with foam and creating chaos. James called out, "Remember the hangars in Kuwait?" Ghost's voice carried a hint of, "Bishop said you were alone." "Oh, Bishop, you were wrong just like you were wrong in 91. A new voice cut through the chaos. It was Marcus Bishop, emerging from one of the SUVs. His expensive suit was a stark contrast in this war zone he had created. He was accompanied by James, who spoke quietly into a hidden microphone. "You want to talk about 91? James said, "Let's talk about those files you claim to have. The evidence is all at risk tonight, along with your whole operation. You've built quite an empire here, haven't you? Weapons, drugs, money laundering. It's quite the operation you've got going on." Bishop laughed. "I gave these men purpose. The government abandoned them, but I gave them a mission. I used their skills for my private war. You want to talk about war? What about Sandstorm? The missing weapons, the supplies that disappeared? You think your precious files tell the whole story?" James smiled in the darkness. Kate understood. Oh, now, he had baited Bishop perfectly, making him incriminate himself in front of dozens of witnesses. Actually, James said calmly, I think you just did. Suddenly, floodlights blazed from every direction. FBI teams emerged from hiding, weapons drawn. Agent Ramirez's voice boomed through a megaphone. Marcus, Bishop, you are surrounded. We have your confession on multiple recordings. The look of realization on Bishop's face was almost worth the broken windows. You never had any files, he said, understanding finally dawning. I don't need them, James replied. I just need you to admit what you've been doing, past and present, as FBI agents moved in. Ghost tried to rally his men for a fight, but the sight of military police vehicles rolling in changed their minds. One by one, Bishop's empire began to crumble. The night wasn't over. There would be resistance, arrests, and revelations that would shake the community. But watching Bishop being led away in handcuffs, James Connor allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes the best way to win a war is to let your enemy defeat himself. The aftermath of the raid transformed the quiet gas station into a hub of law enforcement activity. FBI agents processed and arrested gang members while military police secured evidence. James stood with Kate, watching Bishop being interrogated in the back of an FBI vehicle. Kate said, You were planning this, weren't you? James replied, Not exactly. But I recognized the opportunity when those steel scorpions first showed up. Agent Ramirez approached, holstering her weapon. Mr. Connor, we've been building. James replied, The real proof was in his guilt, his paranoia about those old files, and now we have his confession plus evidence of his current operation. Ramirez smiled. The weapons, cash we found in his warehouse, enough to arm a small army. Ghost was being led past in handcuffs. He stopped looking at James with a mix of respect and resignation. You did a great job, James. Bishop played us all, but he played you, Tyler. I just showed everyone what he really was. There were steel scorpions in a line being processed by federal agents. Most of them looked young and lost. They'd been manipulated into joining Bishop's organization. What happens to them? Kate asked, nodding toward the younger gang members. They'll get a chance to make it right. Ramirez answered. Many of them were coerced or manipulated. We're working with veteran services to offer alternatives. He joined them, and his CIA credentials drew cautious looks from the FBI agents. Connor, we found something interesting in Bishop's office files on other operations in other cities. This wasn't just local, of course. James said Bishop was building a network using veteran bike gangs as cover for weapons and drug distribution. Probably has similar setups across the country, which means this is just the beginning. Ramirez added, We'll need your help on unraveling the rest of his network. Missing weapons from military bases. Thompson mused, drugs. Bishop had set up a whole shadow infrastructure in seemingly innocent businesses. A commotion drew their attention, and it turned out that Officer Martinez was being let out in handcuffs. His police uniform was a stark reminder of how deep the corruption ran and how many others were involved. Kate asked how many more were involved, and that's what we're going to find out, replied Iyer. Mr. Connor, would you be willing to consult on the larger investigation? James watched as more evidence was brought out of Bishop's vehicles, laptops, documents, and phones. He had one condition. Thankfully, those young veterans Bishop recruited got help, not just jail time. Thompson assured him the military is involved now and they take care of their own, the right way. Pete emerged from the station carrying fresh coffee for the law enforcement teams. The place is a bit of a mess, but structurally sound. We can probably reopen in a few days, or even sooner. Ramirez said, We'll have teams help with repairs. This station's going to be under protection for a while. Bishop might be down, but his network is still out there. Out there, Lisa arrived having heard about the raid on the news. She stared at the scene in disbelief. All this because some bikers tried to cause trouble. James corrected her. All this because people stood together against corruption. Bishop's empire was built on intimidation and fear. Once someone stood up to him, it was bound to crumble. A military vehicle pulled up, and a senior officer stepped out. James recognized the insignia. It was the Army Criminal Investigation Division. They'll want to know about the missing weapons, he told Thompson. Bishop's operation explains a lot of unsolved cases and raises new questions. How many other bishops are out there using veteran gangs as cover? Thompson added. Kate watched as more evidence was loaded into FBI vans. Will it ever really be over? She asked. It'll be over soon, James assured her. Bishop's finished. His organization will be dismantled, but there's more work to do and you'll help. James touched his Purple Heart pin, thinking of all the veterans Bishop had exploited. It's so sad. These young veterans have been exploited. They deserve better than to become pawns in Bishop's private war. The sun was rising over Sunset Valley Gas Station, marking the end of the longest night in its history. As James watched federal agents documenting evidence and processing prisoners, he knew this was really just the beginning. Bishop's network would lead them to other operations, other cities where veterans were being exploited. The Quiet G gas station had become the first domino in what would become a nationwide investigation. James Connor, the last war hero, wasn't done fighting yet. Just 3 days after the raid, the Sunset Valley gas station reopened. The broken windows had been replaced, the bullet holes patched, but subtle changes remained. The FBI kept a close eye on things, and military police regularly passed by on patrol. James sat at the counter, watching Kate direct a team of contractors installing upgraded security systems. The station had become something of a symbol, the place where Bishop's empire began to fall. The latest report from Thompson Ramirez said, sliding. He nodded and said he was building franchise operations, with each cell independent but connected. We've arrested 12 more dirty cops, Ramirez continued. Martinez is talking, trying to make a deal. The corruption went deeper than anyone suspected. There was a group of Steel Scorpions bikes impounded behind the station, their chrome dulled by forensics powder. Tyler and most of his crew were in federal custody, but some of the younger members had been released to veteran support programs. One of the young riders stopped by earlier mention joining them. Tommy, I think his name was, wanted to apologize. They're not bad kids. James said, just lost. Bishop knew how to exploit that. The bell chimed as Pete rushed in, holding a newspaper. You need to see this, Bishop said. The headline read, Crime Boss Reveals Nationwide Network of Veteran Exploitation. That's a smart move. James nodded. He's trying to bargain his way to a lighter sentence by exposing his partners. That's not all. We found evidence of weapons shipments to conflict zones overseas. Bishop wasn't just running a criminal empire. He was operating a private arms trade, too. Ghost's interrogation had yielded similar revelations. The former Delta Force operator had provided details about training camps where veterans were recruited and radicalized. They targeted the vulnerable ones. James explained that veterans struggling with civilian life often feel abandoned by the system. Bishop offered them a sense of purpose, a sense of brotherhood and steady pay. It was like a terrorist cell. Ramirez noted that he used military structure because that's what they understood, and they turned their training against them. Lisa approached with fresh coffee, which she'd insisted on returning to work. She refused to let fear change her routine. There were more reporters outside. They wanted interviews about the raid. Let them wait, Kate said firmly. We're not here for publicity. Thompson's car pulled up outside, and the CIA agent hurried in. Connor, we've got movement. Bishop's associates in other states are starting to panic. They're trying to destroy evidence, but it's too late. James smiled once Bishop started talking. He knew that the whole house of cards was bound to fall. We've got teams moving in on locations in Texas, Florida, and Nevada. Ramirez added that they're doing synchronized raids just like here. The veterans James asked about are the ones Bishop recruited most. They're cooperating. Thompson assured him that they're being offered deals in exchange for information. They're being offered rehabilitation instead of prison. The new security cameras hummed quietly, their lenses tracking movement outside. Kate had installed a state-of-the-art system, determined to prevent any future threats. Bishop's preliminary hearing is tomorrow. Ramirez said they're charging him with everything from RICO violations to international arms trafficking. He'll try to cut a deal. James predicted he'd offer up his whole network and exchange for leniency. Let him, Thompson replied. Every name he gives us leads to another operation. We can shut down a military convoy. They made their way past the station, heading towards Bishop's warehouse. They were still cataloging the weapons and cash found there, Kate said thoughtfully. When those bikers first showed up, I thought they were just local trouble. I never imagined it would lead to all this. That's how these operations work, James explained. They hide in plain sight, using ordinary businesses as cover. But pull one thread, and the whole thing unravels. Ramirez finished. Pete returned from checking the pumps. The military police said they found more weapons. Hidden compartments in some of those Steel Scorpions bikes. Bishop thought of everything. Thompson mused, using bikers as mobile transport, gas stations as distribution hubs. It was brilliant in a twisted way, but he made one mistake. James said quietly. He forgot that not all veterans can be bought. Some of us still remember what we fought for. The Purple Heart pin on his collar caught the morning light, a reminder of sacrifices made and principles upheld. Outside, another news van pulled up, but inside the station, life continued. As usual, they'd won this battle, but James knew the war wasn't over. Bishop's network was just one head of a larger hydra, but for now, watching Kate's return to life, seeing Lisa serve coffee without fear, that was enough. Sometimes victory wasn't about big battles. It was about small stands at quiet gas stations where ordinary people refused to be intimidated. And sometimes the last war hero was exactly who was needed to remind everyone what they were fighting for: Bishop. The preliminary hearing brought a lot of attention to the courthouse. There were so many people there, including media, federal agents, and curious onlookers. James Conner took the witness stand and wore his Purple Heart P prominently. He looked very impressive, even in a formal setting. Mr. Conner, the federal prosecutor, began by asking James to explain how he first became aware of Mr. Bishop's criminal enterprise. James said that it started with intimidation at his local gas station. He spoke in a steady voice, but the tactics they used were very professional. They were too professional for ordinary gang activity. Kate sat in the gallery watching Bishop's face as James detailed the events. The former colonel maintained his military bearing, but his eyes betrayed his growing unease. You could tell that he recognized these tactics. In the gallery, I watched Bishop's face as James detailed the events. The former colonel maintained his military bearing, but his eyes betrayed his growing unease. You could tell he was struggling with what he was seeing. The prosecutor asked, "From Desert Storm, did you see these same tactics being used?" James confirmed that Bishop had used the same methods, exploiting military resources for private gain. But this time, he'd expanded his reach by using veterans instead of supplies. Bishop's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled. The connection between past and present was too relevant to ignore. "Tell us about the night of the raid," the judge said. The prosecutor continued, and James described the coordinated attack on the station. He explained how Bishop's forces had employed military strategies, cutting power, and attempting to jam communications. This was a standard approach for a covert operation. Mr. Bishop was present and revealed himself when he thought he had the upper hand. He admitted to everything, including weapons trafficking, veteran exploitation, and even his activities during Desert Storm. Bishop shifted in his seat, realizing how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered during the lunch recess. Agent Ramirez updated James on the "Hey, James, I just heard some big news. It looks like the broader investigation teams in Texas raided 3 more locations. It seems like the same setup with veteran gangs, strategic gas stations, and corrupt local officials. I'm not surprised, given what we've been talking about. Bishop's template arming terrorists," James said quietly. "The ultimate betrayal." Back in the courtroom, Bishop's lawyer tried to paint his client as a patriot. Mr. Bishop provided employment and purpose to forgotten veterans. How is that criminal? By turning them into criminals. James countered by using their training and trauma for his private war. That's not helping veterans. It's exploiting them. Ghost testified next. His prison jumpsuit a stark contrast to his military bearing. He detailed Bishop's recruitment methods, how they identified and groomed vulnerable veterans. Veterans, we offered them what the system didn't. Ghost admitted that we set up the Brotherhood, gave them a decent paycheck, but it came with a price. Their integrity, their honor. Tyler's testimony followed. The young Steel Scorpions leader looked lost without his gang colors. Bishop's people found me at the VA hospital. They said they had a program for vets, helping them transition to civilian life. They never mentioned it was criminal until we were in too deep. During another recess, Kate observed the proceedings' impact on James. "This is personal for you, isn't it?" she asked. "It's a reminder of what we fought for," James replied, his voice soft and sad. "What we betrayed." Pete arrived with news from the station. More young vets were showing up, and the word was spreading about the support programs Ramirez set up. They wanted out of Bishop's organization. "That's what this is really about," James said, his eyes glistening. "Giving them a chance to reclaim their honor." The prosecution presented evidence of Bishop's weapons operation. Crates of military hardware had been found in his warehouses. Financial records showed millions in illegal arms sales. The prosecutor presented sales surveillance photos of transactions with known terrorist groups. Bishop didn't just build a criminal empire, the prosecutor argued. He created a shadow military using America's veterans as his private army. Lisa had come to watch the proceedings, sitting with Kate during the afternoon session. "I can't believe all this started at our state," she whispered. Sometimes the biggest changes start in the smallest places, Kate replied as the day wound down. Bishop finally broke his military stance and requested to address the court, ignoring his lawyer's objections. Everything I did, he said, was for the veterans. The system let them down. I gave them purpose. You gave them chains. James interrupted, drawing a warning from the judge. You turned their loyalty into slavery. The judge called for order, but the damage was done. Bishop's outburst had revealed his true nature. He wasn't a patriot. He was a manipulator who took advantage of vulnerable veterans outside the courthouse. Reporters swarmed for comments. James declined interviews, but Ramirez made a brief statement. Today marks the beginning, not the end. She announced, Bishops. The network extends across the country, and we won't stop until every operation is shut down and every exploited veteran is offered a chance at redemption. Back at the gas station that evening, James sat with Kate, Pete, and Lisa watching news coverage of the hearing. Bishop was looking at life, Thompson reported, joining them. His lawyers are trying to deal, but the evidence is overwhelming. What about the other operations? Kate asked, falling like dominoes. Ramirez added, arriving with fresh intel. Bishop's associates are scrambling. Some are trying to save themselves by turning evidence, while others are trying to flee. The veterans are in a tough spot. James asked his primary concern, and it was unchanged. Rehabilitation programs are in place. Thompson assured him the military is involved now, making sure they get real help and real opportunities. The station's new security cameras hummed quietly, scanning empty streets. The Steel Scorpions were gone, and their territory was now patrolled by the FBI and military police. Lisa said, How did you know that first day when they showed up? How did you know it would lead to all this? James touched his Purple Heart pin, thinking back to his time in Vietnam. There, he'd learned to recognize patterns like the way Bishop operated, using veterans to set up distribution networks. It was too organized for ordinary gang activity. He was building something bigger, something worse, a private army. Pete said that Bishop had used men who'd lost their way. James nodded, remembering. Bishop had forgotten one thing, though. True soldiers never forget their oath, their honor. Once they saw a way out, they took it. Kate finished the night, settling over Sunset Valley gas station. But it was James Connor, the last war hero, watched the news coverage with his unlikely band of allies, and he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Sometimes the greatest victories start with a simple stand at a quiet gas station where ordinary people refuse to be intimidated. The war wasn't over, but tonight they'd won an important battle, and tomorrow they'd continue. Fighting for every veteran, Bishop had betrayed the media frenzy around Bishop's trial. This brought unexpected attention to the Sunset Valley gas station, where reporters camped outside, hoping to catch James or Kate for interviews. But there were other visitors too, veterans who'd heard about the support programs and were seeking a way out of similar organizations. This was the third one this morning, Kate said, watching a young veteran nervously approach the station. They all came in the same way, James J.S. nodded, recognizing the military bearing beneath the biker leather. We're just testing the waters to make sure it's safe. The young man entered, his gang patches partially covered, his eyes scanning the station. He looked like he was in combat training, but he was really just looking for Connor. He said quietly, Mike was with the Raiders in Nevada, Bishop's operation there. James asked, though he already knew the answer. Mike nodded, saying that it was a similar setup, with corrupt cops and weapons moving through truck stops. He said he'd heard you were helping guys get out, and James replied, I know, but you've come to the right place. Ramirez entered, her voice warm and welcoming. I've set up a temporary office nearby, coordinating with veteran services. I've also got another one here. She gestured to Mike's patches, Raiders. James confirmed. We've been watching them. Ramirez said, Your intel could be valuable. Mike shifted uncomfortably. Look, I ain't looking to be no snitch. I just want out. I've got a kid on the way, and I need to make things right. Nobody's asking you to snitch. James assured him. But if you want help, you need to be honest about what you know. Pete brought coffee, and he brought his earlier nervousness around bikers. His nervousness was replaced with understanding in the house. He said, Take your time. Mike's story echoed others. They'd heard that a former Marine struggled after discharge. He was recruited at a VA hospital. The Raiders promised him brotherhood and purpose, and they promised him good money. By the time he realized what he was involved in, it felt too late to leave. They got their hooks in deep. Mike explained, Know where your family lives, where your kids are. It's so important to go to school, and make it clear there's no walking away. That's what Ramirez noted, too. Bishop's arrest changed everything. His whole network was vulnerable. Thompson arrived with fresh intelligence. The raiders are falling apart. Leadership is scattered. They're trying to destroy evidence. It's the perfect time to move. How many others want out? James asked Mike. Most of the younger guys we signed up to be soldiers, not criminals. But the senior members, the true believers, they're getting desperate. Kate asked, and you could hear the concern in her voice talking about one. The last big move is something to prove they're still strong. James and Thompson exchanged looks. They're planning a show of force. Thompson said, try to prove Bishop's arrest hasn't weakened them. Multiple chapters are coordinating. Mike added, they've been stockpiling weapons and watching federal movements. They're going to hit hard and make an example of what Ramirez demanded. Mike looked at the gas station. He thought about anyone who helps take them down. The implications were clear. Sunset Valley had become a symbol of both resistance and vulnerability. We need to, Thompson said. Let's go ahead and strike first. We need to hit their leadership before they can even think about coordinating. James countered. We let them come this time, but we're ready for them. I know it's a bit crazy, but we've got to be prepared. Pete protested. After everything that's happened, it's just not safe. We've got to be careful. Ramirez interrupted. I understand what James is saying. They'll commit all their resources, expose their entire network, and walk right into a trap. James finished. Mike, you've got to understand. We let them come this time, but we're ready for them. We've got to be careful, but we've got to be ready. Mike watched, and he saw that James was right. He'd done the same thing with Bishop. He'd let him think he had the upper hand, and then he'd hit him where it hurt. Sometimes the best thing to do was to let them think they had the advantage. James explained, the best way to defeat an enemy is to let them choose the battlefield, but make sure it's rigged in your favor. Over the next few hours, they developed the plan. Mike provided details about raider operations, their tactics, and their weaknesses. Thompson coordinated with federal teams across 3 states. Ramirez arranged for additional surveillance and support. They'll come at night, Mike predicted. There'll be multiple teams coordinated assault. They've got police scanners, radio jammers, professional gear, just like Bishop's attack. Kate remembered because it was similar to what happened before. It's the same playbook, James said. Military tactics adapted for criminal operations, but that makes them predictable. Lisa, who'd been quietly listening, spoke up. What about the station? All our regular customers. We close early. Kate decided to make it look like we're scared, reducing ours because of threats. Perfect. Thompson nodded. Let them think they're winning the psychological war. James studied the station blueprints, marking key positions we'll need to coordinate with local law enforcement. The honest ones stage federal teams here, here, and here. Make sure we control all approaches. What about me? Mike asked. You've done your part, Ramirez assured him. We'll get you into protective custody. Start the paperwork for the support program. As evening approached, they began implementing the plan. Kate posted notices about reduced hours. Pete secured equipment and value. Federal teams established hidden positions around the property. James watched the sunset, remembering other battles and other ambushes. They think they're planning an attack. He mused. Really, they're walking into their own surrender ceremony. You sound. I'm pretty confident, Kate said with a reassuring smile. I understand men like this. They're so focused on appearing strong that they forget to check for weakness. Bishop made the same mistake. As darkness fell, the station grew quiet, but in the shadows, dozens of federal agents waited. Surveillance teams monitored communications and tracked raider movements across 3 states. Everything was prepared. Kate asked as they did final checks, what if they don't come? James touched his purple heart pin, a habit that had become familiar to them all. They'll come, he said. Men like us. They just can't help themselves. Their pride won't let them walk away from a challenge. When they do, Lisa asks, then we finished what started here, not just Bishop's empire, but every organization that preys on veterans. Sometimes it takes a small stand to start a bigger change. The night settled over Sunset Valley, and the gas station was thick with anticipation. In the distance, they could hear motorcycles, not approaching, but gathering the raiders. They were coming just as predicted, but this time, the last war hero wasn't just. He was defending a gas station and finishing a mission that had been 30 years in the making. He was giving lost veterans a chance to reclaim their honor. And somewhere in the darkness, redemption was waiting. Midnight approached the Sunset Valley gas station like a gathering storm. James Connor stood by the window watching the surveillance feeds. He could see that raiders were gathering at multiple staging points. They were coordinating impressively. It was like military precision applied to criminal intent. Thompson reported that he was monitoring radio traffic. There were 3 groups of 20 bikes each, plus support vehicles. They were running dark and using night vision. James had expected this. James nodded, his eyes scanning the scene with a professional's keen gaze. The military tactics they were employing were clear, and it was evident that they were treating this as a combat operation. Ramirez checked positions with her teams, and it was reassuring to see federal agents hidden throughout the area, supported by tactical units and military police. However, the raiders were unaware of this, and to them, the gas station appeared vulnerable. Mike's intel was rock solid, and Ramirez confirmed that they were following Bishop's playbook to a T. Power cuts first, then communications jamming. How long, Kate wondered, checking the backup generators. 10 minutes. James, they figured they'd wait for their recon team to confirm the station's empty, except for basic security. Pete kept an eye on their new security system, watching blips appear on the tactical display. They were surrounding us 4 layers deep, following the standard infiltration pattern. James explained outer containment strike teams, support units, command element. Bishop had taught them well. Lisa, who had insisted on staying despite everyone's objections, watched the gathering forces with growing concern. There were so many of them. Numbers don't matter, James. He told her they were fighting the last war using tactics they'd already seen before. The first phase began exactly as predicted. The street lights went dark, followed by the power to surrounding buildings. But the station's new generators kicked in seamlessly, maintaining critical systems. Communications are going dark. Thompson warned they're starting their electronic warfare. Let them think it's working. James instructed everyone to switch to backup frequencies. The raiders appeared on the perimeter, black-clad figures moving with military precision. Their advance was textbook coordinated. A team was securing approaches. They're setting up their firing positions, and they're good at it. Ramirez admitted that he watched through night vision optics, and he said they're predictable. James corrected him and said, "See how they're focusing on standard entry points, forgetting about the underground fuel tank access that we converted." Kate watched the raiders deploy and remembered how Bishop's forces had made the same mistake. "They think they're in control," and James nodded. He said, "That's because they're forgetting the first rule of combat. Never assume you know all your enemy's capabilities." The raiders' command vehicle arrived in a modified tactical truck that would have looked at. It was a tense situation. They were back in a war zone, and their leader, Colonel Jackson, had been Bishop's rival before the arrest. Now he was trying to assert control over the scattered organization. Jackson's presence was a new development. This wasn't just about them. James explained that it was about power. Jackson wanted to prove he could handle resistance. The raiders' attack began with precision. Flashbangs hit windows, and smoke grenades were deployed around entrances. However, the gas station's new defenses neutralized each one. They didn't realize they were shooting blanks. Ryer smiled as every attack hit exactly where we wanted it to. James watched Jackson coordinate his forces, remembering similar operations from his military days. He was following standard assault protocols. There were only 3 minutes left until they breached. Federal teams were in position, waiting for your signal. The raiders' main force approached, their boots silent on the pavement. Night vision goggles gave them confidence in the darkness, but they couldn't see the infrared strobes that would blind their equipment. "Command now," Kate said, her finger hovering over the defense system controls. "Wait," James cautioned. "Let them commit fully. Jackson needs to be inside our perimeter." The first raiders reached the station doors, placing breaching charges. The others established sniper positions, completely unaware they were being watched by federal marksmen. 2 minutes later, Ramirez updated all teams. "Report," he said. "Report ready." James touched his Purple Heart pin, a quiet gesture of respect for what was about to happen. These men weren't evil. They were lost soldiers who'd forgotten their true purpose. "Remember," he told the federal teams, "these are veterans. They deserve a chance to surrender with honor." Jackson's voice crackled over their intercepted communications. "All units," he said, "execute the plan." The raiders moved as one, breaching charges detonating, rushing forward. But nothing worked as planned. Their night vision went blind. Smoke grenades were vented harmlessly. Every entrance proved to be a prepared kill zone. Now, James commanded, floodlights blazed from hidden positions. Federal teams emerged from concealment. The raiders found themselves surrounded by an overwhelming force. "Colonel," he said, "surrender now." The raiders froze. They were surrounded by overwhelming force. Jackson Ramirez's voice boomed through superior speakers. "Your forces are surrounded. All approaches are covered. Surrender now." The raiders froze, their military training warring with criminal intent. Some raised weapons, but Jackson's voice stopped them. "Stand down," he ordered, recognizing the futility of resistance. James stepped out of his Purple Heart, catching the artificial light. "Hello, Colonel," he said. "I've been expecting you." Jackson emerged from his command vehicle, a mix of anger and respect on his face. "Connor should have known this whole thing stinks of your Vietnam-era tactics," he said. "The difference is I never forgot what the uniform meant." James replied, "You did too. You did as federal agents moved in, securing weapons and suspects." James approached Jackson. "Your men get the same deal as Bishop's. They help us shut down these operations. They get real support. They get real chances to rebuild. If we don't, then you face the consequences alone. It's up to you, Colonel. You can keep destroying lives, or you can help us save them. Over the next hour, we'll process the raiders. We'll secure the weapons. We'll collect the evidence." Many of the younger members immediately accepted the offer of support. They're ready to escape. Criminal life. Kate watched from the station door as former enemies became cooperating witnesses. "Will this really end it?" she asked James. "Yes, this chapter, but there are other organizations, other lost veterans who need help finding their way back." "You'll keep fighting," James said with a smile. "Someone has to. Every veteran deserves a chance to remember their honor." As dawn approached, she saw that the Sunset Valley gas station had become more than just a battlefield. It was becoming a symbol of redemption, a place where lost soldiers could find their way home. The last war hero. The mission wasn't over, but tonight, dozens of veterans had taken their first steps back toward the light. In a small gesture of hope, a Purple Heart pin reflected the rising sun, reminding us that some battles are fought not with weapons, but with wisdom and compassion. The morning after the raiders' surrender brought new challenges. Federal agents processed evidence while military police coordinated with veteran services. Sunset Valley Gas Station had become command central for an operation that now spanned 5 states. The final count, Ramirez reported, was 47 raiders. In custody, including Colonel Jackson. 32 have already agreed to cooperate, and the weapons Thompson asked for are enough to outfit a small army. It's some of the best military hardware, straight from active bases. This goes deeper than Bishop or Jackson. James studied the evidence photos spread across Kate's office desk. Those serial numbers are from recent shipments. Someone still actively in military supplies could be why Jackson moved so quickly. Kate suggested bringing fresh coffee. He wasn't just trying to prove strength, he was protecting his supply chain. Pete entered. With more news, 3 more veterans just showed up. They were former raiders from other chapters, and they wanted to turn themselves in at the station. The parking lot had become a staging area for law enforcement, with impounded motorcycles lined one side and federal vehicles occupied the other. Lisa was working the counter, serving coffee to a mix of agents and reformed gang members. She found something interesting in Jackson's files. Thompson said, laying out documents. He was communicating with someone high-ranking in a military procurement office. James examined the papers. He recognized the name on the documents, General Howard Phillips. "I know that name," he said. "You should have called me." IRES confirmed he's Deputy Director of Military Logistics Controls Equipment Distribution for 3 branches, which is the perfect position to divert supplies. James mused that Bishop and Jackson were just middlemen. Then he had a thought. Phillips is the real source. A young raider, barely out of his teens, approached James. "Sir, some of us were talking about what you said about honor." "Go on." James encouraged him. "We know things about the supply chain. About Phillips, most of us joined thinking we were helping other vets. We never knew we were arming terrorists. Agent Ramirez." Everything James advised, "Help us stop this completely." As the young man spoke with Ramirez, more pieces fell into place. "There are lots of other organizations out there too," James replied. "Phillips built a nationwide network using military precision to create criminal enterprises, but why?" "I'm not sure," Lisa replied. "I joined them during my break, and he was already a general." "He's greedy," Thompson answered. "We found offshore accounts with millions from arms sales." "Power," James corrected. "Phillips is a true believer. He thinks he's building some kind of private army using veterans as his personal force." Ramirez returned with updates, Jackson said. Phillips is planning something big. Some kind of demonstration of force when he's realized his network is compromised and wants to show strength before everything collapses. The station's security system beeped, showing multiple vehicles approaching. But these weren't threats. They were more veterans coming to turn themselves in. They're choosing sides, James observed, finally seeing the truth about Phillips's operation. We need to move fast, Thompson urged. Before Phillips can destroy evidence, James said firmly, we need to be smart. Phillips expects a direct approach, military tactics against military targets. What do we do? What's the alternative? James smiled slightly. We let him think he's winning, just like with Bishop and Jackson. Pride makes men careless. Kate understood and agreed to use his own methods against him. Exactly. Phillips built his empire using military precision, which makes him predictable. Throughout the day, more veterans arrived. Some were raiders, while others were from different organizations. They all had the same story: recruited with promises of purpose, trapped by manipulation, and set up for processing. James advised Ramirez that every veteran who turns himself in is a potential witness against Phillips. It's already been done. She let him know that the military police are working with the VA to provide real help this time. Thompson received an urgent call, and Phillips is moving and transferring files to clear counts. James said he's following standard protocol and emergency evacuation procedures. Pete asked, how is that perfect? Because now we know exactly what he'll do next. Military doctrine is predictable, especially to someone who spent years studying it. The station had become more than a battlefield. It was becoming a symbol of redemption where veterans could reclaim their honor. Each arrival weakened Phillips's grip on power. James told Kate, we're not just fighting a criminal empire. We're fighting for the soul of every veteran. Phillips corrupted, and Phillips himself. She asked, he'll come. Men like him can't resist a direct challenge when he realizes how many of his people are turning. He'll have to act. As evening approached, James gathered their key allies. The next phase would require perfect coordination using Phillips's own tactics against him. James explained, he thinks he's fighting a conventional war. But there's something even simpler that's his real weakness. He forgot what the uniform truly means. The purple heart pin on his collar caught the fading light, a reminder of sacrifices made and honor maintained around them. Veterans continued to arrive, choosing redemption over corruption. This wasn't just about taking down a criminal empire. It was about saving lost soldiers, giving them a chance to remember their true purpose. And it was about a general who had betrayed everything he once stood for. He was about to learn that some battles can't be won. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the truth about who you really are. General Howard Phillips sat in his Pentagon office, watching his empire crumble through secure video feeds. Bases across the country reported that veterans were turning themselves in, exposing weapons caches, and revealing distribution networks. Bishop and Jackson's organizations were completely dismantled. Other chapters were falling hourly. Philly studied the footage from the Sunset Valley gas station, where James Connor stood talking with former raiders. Oh my, he said. One Vietnam-era spook brings down decades of work. Sir, we need to initiate the final protocols, evidence destruction, account transfers. No, Connor, he continued. I'm not sure you understand military procedure. What's our move, sir? I think we go where he won't expect, Phillips replied, smiling. We'll hit him where he can't defend. At the gas station, James received urgent intel from Thompson. Phillips is moving, but not how we predicted. There's no evidence destruction, no account transfers because he knows we're coming. James nodded. He's watching out for that. James nodded again. Ramirez added, checking surveillance feeds. There have been some unauthorized withdrawals of personnel and equipment. James realized that he's not running or attacking. Kate overheard the exchange here after what happened to Bishop and Jackson. James corrected, not here. Phillips thinks like a general. James smiled. He'll target infrastructure, supply lines, and veterans support centers. The veterans support centers are important. Thompson interrupted, where we're processing his former soldiers. James nodded. Exactly. Hit the weak points. Show everyone what happens to those who betray him. Ramirez's phone buzzed with alerts. 3 centers already reported suspicious activity. Armed men in military vehicles. James said, we need to scare veterans back into line. Thompson urged, no, James. He's trying to shut down the defection pipeline. James countered, that's what he expects. He's trying to protect the vulnerable points. Then what? James smiled slightly. We let him think it's working. We'll hit what he's really protecting, Kate. She asked, "What's his reputation?" Phillips built everything. On his image as a patriotic general helping veterans, that's his real vulnerable point. Over the next hour, they monitored Phillips's forces gathering. They were former Special Forces operators, corrupt military police, and mercenaries, all coordinating for simultaneous strikes on 4 primary targets. Ramirez reported support centers in major cities. They were classic shock and awe tactics while we're distracted defending them. James noted that Phillips will destroy his real evidence. These were Pentagon files, financial records, and communication logs. So we let him hit the centers. Pete asked, horrified. No. Thankfully, we've already evacuated all the veterans and secured every piece of evidence. It seems that Phillips is committing forces to attack empty buildings. Thompson understood that while his own office is vulnerable, he's a general fighting the last war and expecting us to react like soldiers. Kate watched the tactical displays showing Phillips's forces moving into position. It's so inspiring to see how one act of defiance can inspire others to resist. James replied, "It's so inspiring to see how one act of defiance can inspire others to resist." Lisa brought updates from monitoring radio traffic. She said they're starting their attacks. There are military vehicles and armed men finding empty buildings. James finished and broadcast their presence to every law enforcement agency in range. Ramirez's phone lit up. Pentagon security is responding. Phillips's unauthorized mobilization just got flagged by 3 different commands. James explained that military precision leaves patterns. Patterns create evidence. Thompson received confirmation from his contacts. The Joint Chiefs are moving. Phillips's office is being secured. All his files. All his records. Everything. He thought he was protecting us by distracting us. James nodded. The next few hours brought a lot of new developments. Phillips' forces found themselves surrounded at empty support centers. Pentagon investigators seized computers and documents. The general's carefully constructed facade crumbled under official scrutiny. He's running. Ramirez announced that she was tracking Phillips' vehicle, which was leaving Washington and heading west on back roads. James said calmly, "Every mile takes him further from his power base. You don't want to stop him." Kate asked, "Is he going to make it?" He's already stopped a general without forces, resources, or authority. His own actions convicted him. More reports flooded in, and Phillips's offshore accounts were frozen. His military contacts were under investigation. The network he spent decades building collapsed in hours. He's reaching out to his last loyal operators. Thompson reported trying to organize some kind of resistance, but his messages are going to people already in custody. James noted that every response leads investigators to new evidence. As night fell, the Sunset Valley gas station remained calm, and the Veteran Processing Center operated smoothly. Phillips thought he could control veterans through fear and manipulation. But James told Kate that he'd forgotten what really drives soldiers: honor, duty, and the desire to serve something greater than themselves. Now, every veteran who turns himself in, and every operator who chooses to make things right is reclaiming what Phillips tried to steal. The Purple Heart pin caught the evening light, a reminder that some victories don't require weapons or tactics. Sometimes the greatest battles are won. By simply showing others the way back to their true purpose, Phillips would be caught eventually. His empire would be completely dismantled, but the real victory was already won in the eyes of veterans. They remembered their honor, choosing redemption over corruption. It all started with a simple stand at a quiet gas station where one old warrior showed others it was never too late to fight for what was right. 1 month after Phillips's network collapsed, Sunset Valley Gas Station hosted a different kind of gathering. Veterans from across the country came together to celebrate their new beginnings. It was so inspiring to see so many people come together to celebrate their new beginnings. Veterans from across the country, former raiders, reformed gang members, and others who'd escaped Phillips' influence gathered at the gas station to mark this special occasion. Ramirez was there, too, watching the crowd from behind the counter. He reported that there were 812 veterans in rehabilitation programs, 300 million in seized assets, weapons recovered from 37 locations across 12 states, and even a few surprises. Betrayed him, using predictable escape routes and documented procedures. James watched a young veteran playing with his kids in the parking lot a month ago. He'd been running guns for Phillips, but now he was rebuilding his life. The weapons connection goes deeper than we thought. Ramirez continued. International arms dealers, terrorist cells, corrupt military contractors. Phillips's network was just the tip of the iceberg, but his collapse exposed everything. James nodded, like pulling one thread that unravels the whole sweater. Pete was now comfortable among the reformed gang members, were directing traffic in the busy lot. The station had become more than just a business. It was a symbol of redemption. Bishop's trial is starting next week, and Thompson reported that between his testimony and Jackson's evidence, Phillips is looking at multiple life sentences. Lisa emerged from the stockroom carrying supplies for the gathering. There were more veterans arriving, some from as far away as Texas and Florida. They're not just coming for the ceremony, James explained. They're coming to see proof that change is possible. The ceremony was lovely and simple, but oh so powerful. Each veteran received official recognition of their participation in the rehabilitation program. This time, military officials spoke about honor and redemption. A year ago, one former Raider told the crowd, "I thought I was helping veterans by joining Phillips' organization. Today, I'm actually doing it, counseling others who want to escape that life." Ghost now cooperates fully with authorities. He approached James and said, "You knew me, didn't you, from that first day at the station? You saw what Phillips was." "I recognize the patterns," James replied. "Same ones I tracked in Vietnam. Men turning soldiers into criminals, using their training for private wars." Kate watched more vehicles arrive, not motorcycles this time, but family cars bringing veterans and their loved ones. It's hard to believe it all started with some bikers causing trouble. Sometimes that's all it takes, James said. One moment where people choose to stand against intimidation. The Purple Heart pin on his collar caught the sunlight as he addressed the gathering. What Phillips tried to. He tried to steal your identity as well. As soldiers, you have the power to reclaim that. Ramirez gave them an update on ongoing operations. Phillips' arrest had exposed similar networks in other countries. International task forces were using their evidence to dismantle criminal enterprises worldwide. "Your stations are now famous," Thompson told Kate. "Your actions are a symbol of resistance against corruption. Other communities are following your example and standing up to criminal organizations." "We just did what was right," Kate replied. "James showed us how," corrected her. "You all chose to stand together, and I'm so proud of you for it. I just reminded you it was possible." As evening approached, families gathered for a community meal. Former enemies sat together sharing stories of redemption. Children played where once there had been standoffs. "What happens next?" Lisa asked, watching the transformed parking lot. "We keep working," James replied. "There are other Phillips out there, other veterans being exploited. But now they know there's a way out." The station's new security cameras watched quietly, their presence now comforting rather than a threat. The scars from previous battles remained, but they were marks of triumph, not tragedy. Ramirez said one last thing. "Joint Task Force wants you to consult, help identify other networks, guide rehabilitation programs. Getting back in the game." James touched his Purple Heart pin, considering that he'd never really left it. Some wars don't end, they just change battlefields. The sunset-painted Sunset Valley gas station in Golden Light, where once there had been. Violence and fear are now things of the past. Healing and hope are taking their place. Veterans who had lost their way found a path back to honor. All of this began because a couple of bikers provoked the last war hero at a quiet gas station. They thought they were intimidating him, but they ended up starting a chain of events that would dismantle criminal empires and save hundreds of lost soldiers. James Connor watched the gathering, remembering that first confrontation. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting battles, but from showing others they can win their own battles. The Purple Heart caught the last rays of sun. It was a final reminder that true courage isn't about winning fights. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the odds. In a quiet gas station in Sunset Valley, that lesson would never be forgotten. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you'll definitely want to check out these next two. Just click and enjoy.